Hello, and thanks for joining us again on this 13th episode of our Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. So glad that you're a part of this. I pray that God is blessing you as you continue to go through the scriptures with us. And we want to get right to it today. We have a lot to cover. We're going through Genesis chapters 37, 38, and 39, Psalm chapter 13, and Matthew chapter 13 this week in our Well Bible Reading journal. So I pray God will bless you through all of that. And we're going to try and cover some of it today. So I'm going to invite back in Amber and Craig. Amber and Craig, thanks for joining me.
Hey.
Howdy. Good to see you. Good to be back with you guys. Y'all did a great job with Bobby last week, but good to be back.
Thanks to Bobby. He did a great job.
Yeah.
And thanks to Amber. You did a great job with us.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get to it. We are in Genesis chapters 37, 38, and 39, but we're going to focus in on Genesis chapter 38, and then we're going to spend some time also in Matthew chapter 13. So why don't we get started with that? And really just kind of to get us started, I wanted to kind of take a step back and look at the big picture of what's going on here in Genesis chapter 38 and kind of get a big picture of what it looks like in terms of the entire narrative that we're going through in Genesis. Because really we've started the story of Joseph, and the storyline is going to follow Joseph most of the way through to the end of Genesis. But it takes a break here to talk a little bit about Judah, who is historically a very important figure, one of Joseph's brothers. He's one of the older brothers, and it tells us kind of a little bit of a disturbing story about him here. And one of the things that seems to be happening is that there is this compare and contrast going on between Joseph, the character of Joseph, and the character of his brothers. So he's been sold into slavery, and then you kind of go back. The camera pans back to the promised land and to Judah in this story of Judah and Tamar. And then it'll go back to Joseph, where he is tested with the wife of Potiphar, right? And he proves to have this amazing character. Whereas Judah, not so much. Is that what you saw going on, Amber, when you read it? What were some of the things you caught from it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I noticed was that it seems like in the chapters past, anytime that there's brothers or anything like that, there's always, it feels like they are fighting to try to get that blessing that has been promised through Abraham this whole time. That's kind of the theme we keep seeing. And they're always like fighting for it. And it seems to me Judah's like, doesn't seem to care quite as much. He's not really fighting for it because he kind of runs off, and it seems pretty spontaneous that he just kind of goes and marries this Canaanite woman, and
which was which was a big no-no, right?
Exactly. We know that from previous chapters. It's a big no-no, and so there's a good likelihood for him doing that God would choose not to let that promise go through his line. So it seems like he doesn't quite even mind. I actually wrote down that I'm confident that this was a match not made in heaven. This is not probably what God wanted for him. But my question is that it seems that was it custom? I guess my question is, Ellis, was it custom in that time when a wife and they married into a family, was it for the wife to take on the beliefs of the husband, especially here with being a Canaanite woman, they don't have the same beliefs. So I'm assuming that would be custom, that they would normally take on the beliefs of the husband. Is that right?
Yeah. In general, that's the idea. And especially with the Hebrew culture, because they were much more, as being the only really monotheistic faith in that part of the world at that time, they were kind of the inventors, if you will, of monotheism. So especially in a monotheistic culture, because think about it, if you come from a polytheistic culture, which Shua would have, the Canaanite culture, very polytheistic, many gods. So you marry, and hey, bringing in another god is no big deal because you already have,
right.
Hey, the more the merrier, right? So, so for Shua to bring in the Hebrew God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not a problem. I've just worshiping one more God among the other gods. But what the Hebrew faith kind of demanded was that no, you shall have no other gods before me. You got to leave those gods and come, worship my God. We see this. We see that yes, technically, that's the way it's supposed to work. Now, obviously, human nature is very different. So you have the story of Jacob with Rebecca, right? And when they're coming back, she steals the little idol. Remember that?
Her dad.
She's still clinging to that kind of polytheistic culture that she comes from, even though she's already married to Jacob and knows that she must become monotheistic. So you have this fight all the time. The classic kind of good example of that would be Ruth, right? Who marries into the family of of the Hebrew faith. And she comes to where she says, hey, your God shall be my God. Where you go, I will go. Nothing will ever separate us. She's saying that to her mother-in-law, but she had been married to her mother-in-law's son and had taken on that faith. You can see she had taken on the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and she was serious about it.
Yeah.
That was the best case example, but most other cases, there's this constant struggle between the faith I grew up with and now trying to. So you have a lot of syncretism that goes on, and this was the bad part for the Hebrew people, was the syncretism. It wasn't a matter of you can just incorporate some of your beliefs from your gods into our belief. No, no, no. You shall have no other gods before me means you look to only one God. So yeah, it was hard. We can see it not happening. We see it problematic. Well, in this case, I mean, what about Tamar? Has she taken on? She seems to care a little bit more than even Judah does.
That's what it seems. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
So,
I
go
think
ahead.
y'all talked about the character comparisons between Joseph and Judah, and the author of Genesis setting this story up. We set up Joseph, who's sold into slavery. Okay, what I'm kind of interested in what happens with that now. I have to go over and read about Judah. What?
Mhm.
Well, here's a good story, and we're talking about it now. But as I'm reading through it, okay, you kind of get invested in it. This doesn't seem like a really nice guy. Where's God going with this? Then you hit in chapter 39. We're back on Joseph, where he does redeem the situation, and God uses what was intended for evil for good purposes, and Joseph's character shines through. But we also see this comparison between Joseph and Tamar, going back to Tamar in chapter 38, where there's this analysis of identity, comparing the two kind of indirectly, but Tamar is the one that's shown to be righteous at the end of this chapter. And verse 26, Judah says she's more right than I am. And so we know that God, regardless of her actions, God has judged her as righteous. And we see the continuity of her widow identity as she takes off her black clothes, even in the scene where she's not dressed so nice for the activities she has. She feels like she needs to undergo with Judah. She puts her black widow's garments back on at the end, so the continuity of her identity continues. And in a sense, we see through chapter 37 and 39 with Joseph, we have the wardrobe of many colors, or the coat of many colors, stripped off of him. His clothes are stripped as he's thrown into prison by Potiphar after his accusation by his wife. And so Joseph is stripped, but ultimately he's redeemed later in the story, and he's clothed with clothings in the form of the prime minister hood or ship of Egypt to save his brothers and his family, much like Jesus is ultimately becoming the righteous, clothed in righteousness for us, and we're ultimately clothed in his righteousness in baptism. So all that analysis of identity and garments was intriguing to me.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the fact that Tamar is the one deemed righteous, and Rebecca, who we saw a few chapters ago, was not, and we saw Amber pointed out that Rebecca is never mentioned again in Scripture other than her death later in Genesis. But the fact that we have Tamar called out as righteous and Rebecca is not was really stood out to me. And she's actually Tamar is called out in the line of Jesus by Matthew 1:3. Chapter 1.
She's one of 4 women that Matthew mentions in the genealogy. So yeah, this is I think that's a great point and analogy, Craig, to the wardrobe and what's going on with that. This is a chapter that Calvin Klein and Gucci would really like, because there's a lot of wardrobe involved here. All these wardrobe changes, which are significant. I mean, it's like in that Hebrew culture, the way you dressed said something about you, right? It made a statement about who you were. And kings dressed differently from, say, paupers, who dressed differently from, whatever. So you had that is significant. It'd be interesting, you guys, as you go through this scripture, as Craig is saying, is to pay attention to the wardrobe changes. I mean, it's interesting what's happening there. And then Tamar, being a part of the lineage of Jesus and being mentioned, the women who are mentioned in Matthew chapter 1 in the genealogy, Rahab and Tamar,
Ruth.
Bathsheba, and Ruth, right? Ruth was a Moabitess. She was not a Jew. Rahab was a Canaanite. She was not a Jew. and for them to make it into the lineage is a pretty big deal, right? And uh, the way that Tamar acted in this thing. So you mentioned that at the end, um, what he says really is she is more righteous than I. At the very end, he's kind of at the end. Judah turns out to be a big man. He recognizes where he did wrong and says she is more righteous than I am. When she was acting, I mean, she was pretending to be a prostitute, and she actually not just pretending. She slept with her father-in-law, knowing who he was, kind of trapping him basically. And of course, he not knowing who she was, well, he was doing wrong too. It seems like they both were getting pretty muddy there. There was a lot of mud to go around. And at the end, she is deemed as righteous, right? So, what did you guys get from that story? It's a hard story to read. It's hard to really put your finger on it.
I also stood out to me very much about the Matthew, because we went through Matthew and I remember Tamar being in it. And so I remember that. And I thought to myself, wow, like these 4 women who are mentioned here are people that we would choose as most unlikely candidates to be
Mhm.
used by God. And
Mhm.
not only to be used by God, but those 4 women to bring forth the Savior of the world, even more so. And I was just, as I was pondering that, I was thinking to myself, when do I feel like an unlikely candidate to be used by God? Often, I would say. And I was thinking about Tamar and how she must have felt when she was literally taking off these widow clothes, that to everyone around her, these clothes represented who she was, how she was unvalued. She had no power. She had nothing. She just had to wear these clothes to represent who she was. And to take those off, to put on a cover of a prostitute, and just to sleep with her father-in-law. I was thinking to myself, there had to be a moment in Tamar's world, in changing those clothes, that she would have thought, what am I doing? How am I going to be used? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there had to be this moment. And I think this all the time. And it just made me think that when you feel unworthy, unwanted, unusable by God, God is in the business of using the unqualified and the unlikely.
Mhm.
And so I just wanted to just say that, and that was on my heart a lot this week.
No, that's awesome. That's right. One of the things that Tamar was doing, actually, she lived in a man's world, and so she had no power, zero power. So when Judah decided he wasn't going to follow through and give her what was rightly hers, he wasn't going to take care of her. He just wasn't going to take care of her. Now she's in a tough situation, and she uses the only power she has. It's the only power she has as a woman in that culture, and that's her sexuality. It's the only power she literally had. And women in those cultures were often who did that were labeled as harlots or prostitutes or whatever, but really they were just using the only power they had. They were powerless other than their sexuality. They had that they could manipulate men or get what they needed or what they wanted or what was rightfully theirs. So in this case, she's using the only power she has to get what she should have gotten all along. This is why at the end of it, Judah recognizes she was just trying to get what, through the only means available to her, what she should have had, what was rightfully hers, and I didn't give to her. I refused what was rightfully hers. This is why she is more right than I am, or more righteous than I am. He didn't necessarily call her righteous. He just said I'm worse than she is. Because just before that, he had said, what, burn her, right?
That's
I mean,
right.
talk about hypocrisy, right? If she's his daughter-in-law was caught being a temple prostitute, burn her at the stake, right?
And he knew he'd slept with a temple
Yeah,
prostitute.
he knew he had, right? And talk about hypocrisy. And he had just gotten so, yeah, he was in a bad place, obviously. Amber, you mentioned to me earlier about him, possibly your theory is that he was in mourning. Can you tell us a little bit about that? He was
Yeah,
grieving.
he was grieving. That's what I think when I read this story. What Judah's doing here is that he's lost 2 sons because of their wickedness. Um, and by He's supposed to give his 3rd son, the youngest son, to Tamar. That was supposed to be what was supposed to happen. And he says, oh, he's just too young. Go back to your father. And it's almost like he was just shoving her away, wanting to not remember, pushing the issues under the rug, because I think he was grieving. And I think that he had no intentions. Maybe he had good intentions to maybe marry his youngest son to Tamar, but I just don't know if he could do it. And I think Tamar became desperate. I think he probably came of age, and Tamar's like, he still hasn't come for me. He's not coming for me, is he? Like, I think Tamar was desperate in that moment, and I think Judah was grieving, and Tamar was desperate.
Right. I love that. I had never really thought about his grief, to be honest with you. I always approach this text with no good, lousy, hypocrite scum, scumbag for doing that. But honestly, that's brilliant, because you don't think about that. He's flawed, and he's grieving, and he's a human being too. He made a bad decision.
Imagine seeing Tamar in your house. Every time you see her, who are you going to think of? Your sons that you've lost.
That you lost, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Plus, two guys that married her have died. She's like bad luck, right?
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
want to die too.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. And it goes to, I think it goes to the kind of the overarching point really is what you mentioned, is that God still used them, because both of them, Jesus is the Lion of Judah. He's
Yeah.
of the tribe of Judah.
Yeah.
And then also Tamar, through her, she has twins, right? And Perez, one of the twins, is also line of Jesus, right? So big deal.
I think we continue to see the theme that God is redeeming the human messes. He's in the middle of the mess, getting dirty with us, and he's moving his purposes forward in spite of us, because of us, through us. And even though the activities here might technically be sinful in a way or wrong in a way, and whether we're talking about prostitution or what Judah did to Tamar, or what Tamar did, maybe it was revenge in some sense, but ultimately God has judged Tamar as righteous in the sense that the line continued through her. She was honored for a contribution by Matthew, and we have Jesus and salvation because of at least she's part of the story.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that is a recurring theme. One of the wonderful things about the Bible is that it doesn't hide the flaws of its heroes. They're heroes in a very real way. They're heroes of the faith, and yet they're flawed. They're normal people, and they make terrible mistakes. And so that's one of the things we love about the Bible. Yeah. So then I guess we can move to Matthew chapter 13.
Yeah.
And by the way, guys, reading through Genesis 37, 38, 39, there's so much there. We just scratched the surface. I know that you're going to be able to dig into those stories and really get some incredible value. So I encourage you to just spend time with them, because they're just amazing stories. But we moved to Matthew chapter 13, which is also just chock full of stories. We're in this really what's considered the second discourse of Jesus. Remember that in Matthew, there are 5 major discourses. The first is Sermon on the Mount. Second is this one, which is just a series of parables. And Jesus is teaching in parables. Parables are very interesting. A lot of people love parables. I'm not sure that we understand them, but we love to read them. Mark tells us that the parable was a mainstay for Jesus in his preaching and teaching. Mark says Jesus never taught without using parables. He would always use a parable. And so what exactly, now we have a number of parables in this one chapter, but we wanted to kind of focus in on for the most part, the parable of the sower, and then just in parables in general. We kind of wanted to give you a framework for reading the parables and maybe considering some different ways to read it, because typically in a parable, you want to just go and you want to find what the moral of the story is. But Jesus was doing something deeper with the parables. So Craig or Amber, either one of you, what did you get from this, just in general, the parables we're going into?
Let me start off real quick, and I want to kick over to Amber, because I think she has some helpful corrective to what I'm about to say.
Yeah.
Because I pulled from a couple of commentaries, I pulled the theologian C.H. Dodd has a classical definition of parables. Now, let me read it real quick, and I'm going to kick it over to you, Amber, for a corrective to this, because I think you're more right on than even our good friend, Mr. Dodd. He says, at its simplest, the parable is a metaphor or simile drawn from nature or common life, arresting the hearer by its vividness or strangeness and leaving the mind in sufficient doubt about its precise application to tease it into active thought. So using that as a springboard, what do you think, Amber?
Now I feel like I'm all nervous also and all that.
No.
So, I basically, what I did is I just started with the Webster Dictionary. I was like, what Merriam-Webster have to say about it? And then I ended up asking a couple of my friends, five friends specifically, tell me what you think of when you think of Jesus parables. And so here's some digging I've done. So the dictionary version just says, it usually short I can never say that word.
Fictitious. Fictitious, yeah.
That's the word.
Easy for you to say, Alex.
Story that illustrates a moral attitude or religious principle. And then as I asked my friends, it was very similar. They kind of described them as Jesus's way to tell a story that was incredibly memorable and reproducible, that would bring clarity to some sort of moral thing going on in the culture at the time. That's basically the summary of everyone's thing. I think the main point that I want to say is all of them thought you would use the word to clarify. It was a story to help clarify or bring understanding to a point. And so when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about kind of modern day. I was thinking of the boy who cried wolf story. So you have the boy who cried wolf. You have him see a wolf. Twice he cried out wolf. There was no wolf. Third time he cries out wolf. No one believes them. Wolf comes. Bad news, right? And the moral of the story is that you shouldn't lie. You should tell the truth so people will take you seriously, right? And that's sort of very similar, kind of like it's short, it's memorable, clarity to some sort of moral point. I'm not entirely sure this is exactly what Jesus is doing. When I read the parables, this is not what's happening in my mind. What I see is happening is Jesus seems to be using a mode of communication that seems simple when you hear it, because they're word pictures. They're things that people in the culture would have really related to. I'm a farmer. Oh, I sow seeds, right? They're going to relate to the topic, but they're very descriptive. They're almost cryptic, and I don't think they're to bring clarity at all. I think they're the only ones who gain true clarity are the ones who are willing to say, that doesn't make sense. Jesus, tell me more. And when the ones who lean in, the ones who ask for more, have ears to hear, are the ones who get clarity. So I think parables are less about bringing clarity and understanding to a moral point. I feel like parables are more of Jesus's way of, to the ones who really want it, to lean in to his cryptic message that's about him and the way he's changing the world. And so Ellis, my question to you is, why does Jesus choose to use this mode of communication that seems really hard to understand?
Yeah, no, it's good. I think you're right on. And it's unusual because most people, I think you're right, or do misunderstand the purpose of parables. First of all, he uses it because it was a very common thing for the rabbis did teach in parables, and that was not uncommon. So Jesus wasn't necessarily unique in the sense that he used parables. But he used them for that specific reason, and he says it. Those who have ears to hear, eyes to see, but most won't. He basically says that. It was to make the disciples work at it. You've got to work at the parable to get it. You won't get it if you're not willing to work at it. He tells the parable of the weeds. It's in this chapter, Matthew 13, and then later it says later his disciples come and ask him, "Hey, we didn't get it right." I believe anyone could have come back to ask him.
Yeah.
It was only the ones who wanted it bad enough who came back and said, "We can't go back to doing what we're doing until we understand the parable. We've got to understand the parable." Those are the ones that he explained it to. He even says, I'm not sure it's in Matthew, but he says in Mark, "Oh, you don't understand?" He says, "To you I will explain it, not to them, but to you I will explain it," right? Because you want it bad enough. Yeah, the parables were very much that. They were very much this way. Some people believe, and by the way, C.H. Dodd is a classic definition. It's a good definition. He talks in that definition about the mystery, the mystery of it. So I think Dodd's definition is not that far away from the Amber definition, which is also, I think, a good definition. The parables were actually very mysterious and really caused you to have to work at it, and that was the whole idea. Jesus wasn't going to spoon feed it to you. He wanted you to get it. But they were also a form of a very well-known form of story that fell in this framework of story. So you have basically 4 different types of stories that did something. So the first was myth, and myth in the original meaning of the word myth did not mean fictitious. Myth for us has come to mean fictitious. So we think of the Greek myths and which are fictitious, fantastical kind of stories. But the Greek myths, the Greek stories that are fictitious are called myths because they built the Greek worldview. So a myth is any story, true or false, historical or fiction, any story that serves to build a worldview for a people group is a myth. So in that sense, and in that limited sense, the stories out of Genesis, the stories in the Bible are myth in the sense they're true stories. They're true, but they're myth in the sense they built a worldview. They built an entire Hebrew worldview, and it was a monotheistic worldview that they built, right? That's what they're designed to do. That's what myth does. It's any story that builds worldview. Um, Proverb is another form of storytelling that undergirds worldview. So you've built this worldview with these stories, and now the proverbial, or what we call the wisdom material, right, comes in. It undergirds and uplifts and supports the worldview. So proverb or wisdom material supports the worldview that the narratives have built. Then you have satire. Satire begins to question the worldview. And satire uses irony and all kinds of other forms to actually start to question, is that really true? Is that the way it works? Maybe is this belief hypocritical? So it starts to ask those questions. Parable, it explodes worldview. A parable throws a bomb into the worldview and just blows it up, okay? So the parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance, where Jesus, the Samaritan, ends up being the good guy in the story. That's just, you just blew the lawyer who first asked the question, who's my neighbor, would never have said Samaritan. Never. That would have been the last thing on his mind. And Jesus says the Samaritan is your neighbor, and just exploded his worldview. Sometimes I think the thing that hurts us with the parables is we don't realize how explosive they are, how they absolutely just destroy. They do what Jesus said he was going to do, which is turn the world upside down. So
Yeah.
William
Yeah.
Herzog has written a book where he talks about the parables as subversive speech, where people who are oppressed will develop a vocabulary and a way of telling stories that is destroying the oppressor, but without him even knowing it, because it's coded language, right? It's not easy to understand. So I think that's what you have going on with the parables, and it's something to think about as you start to read these stories. Craig, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think that's where I was getting at with Dodd's definition versus what you both have called out as maybe a corrective isn't the right word, but it's almost he doesn't go far enough. Y'all are taking it where it really starts to feel more like what Jesus is trying to get at, because at the end of the chapter, he's asking the disciples, "Do you understand?" And they're saying yes. They won't fully understand what the meaning of their yes is until after the crucifixion or resurrection, when they understand what it means to pick up their cross and truly follow Jesus. But they're getting the sense of it. They're understanding the promise of it, and so their yes is more of a promise than the yes that results. But in that same sense, we have to understand what we're getting into when we enter the story and understand the explosive nature of the world we're entering into. It's that kingdom of God, that kingdom of heaven, which is the center of so many of these parables. Again, breaking through, and God's sovereignty entering into the world through the kingdom to set things to rights, to judge evil, to forgive, and to reconcile. And it reminds me of the John Wesley prayer, of the covenant prayer that you brought up this morning and in your sermon, Ellis, about what are we really signing up for? Do we understand how dangerous this really is?
Yes, when you read that prayer, it's pretty scary what you're asking God to do for you.
You might need to post it in the comments just for those who didn't get a chance to hear it this morning or last couple of weeks.
Yeah, no, that's good. So just take like the parable of the sower, for instance, where the different soils. And part of the problem, of course, and we've talked about this on another podcast, is when we approach the scripture, we kind of always tend to put ourselves in the shoes of the good guy or the right one, right? We're always going to wear the white hat. We're never going to put ourselves in the shoes of the Pharisee. But what happens when we do that is that we sometimes ask all the wrong questions, or we even get the wrong point, maybe, right? What Jesus is wanting to do is, no, I'm going to put you in the shoes of the bad guy so that your worldview will explode, so that you will begin to see what the kingdom of heaven looks like. He says it's a place where the first shall be last, the last shall be first, right? The master will be servant will be master. He's turned the world upside down, and that's what he's doing with these parables. So the parable of the sower, the different seeds, and only one seed falls on good soil. The different soils, right? The hard soil, the rocky soil, the thorny soil, finally the good soil. So we tend to say, well, I hope my soil is the good soil, right? That's one of the scariest parables for me when I was younger, because I was like, oh my gosh, I want to be the good soil. How do I want to be the good soil? But maybe we're supposed to look at it as actually all of us have all four soils at one time or another. But there are times when my heart is hard or hardened and I'm not hearing God. There are times when I'm so overcome with worry, right? The thorny, so that it comes up and chokes out my spiritual life. There are times when my soil is good. So it's just really putting yourself, being sure that you don't always put yourself in the good person's shoes, but that you put yourself in all those shoes, right? That's super important. Do you guys have anything else on Matthew 13? I mean, there's several of the parables, but I mean, we've kind of wanted to really just clarify what a parable looks like.
I think based on, by the way, you explaining the four modes of I don't know what to call it, narrative, was incredible to me. And I think it brings a light there. You see all of those in the scriptures, all of them at some point. I love it. So what I think I would like people to do with that information is when they're reading the parables this week, is to go into it with that lens of Jesus is speaking in a way that's supposed to completely challenge the worldview of the people he's speaking to, and provoke change in them in a way that makes them have to lean in to understand it. And so I also wonder, Ellis, I often see things that remind me of the Old Testament prophets a lot when I'm reading through here. Like, that sounds familiar. Oh, I feel like that phrase was something I've heard before. And just something because I've read the Old Testament prophets before, the Hebrew prophets. Do you think that Jesus sometimes saw himself when he in the parables as someone who was trying to rewrite these warnings of the old prophets here?
Yeah, I think there's most of what Jesus did you could very much call prophetic, in the sense that the prophets, they did two things. And a lot of people, when we think of the prophets, usually people think very much about they're telling the future, right? They're telling you what's going to happen. They're predicting, or they're giving these prophecies. We even call it prophecy when they're predicting the future of what's going to happen. And there certainly is that in the prophetic work. But actually, more often than not, the prophets are not doing that. That's called foretelling. So it's telling the future. But mostly what they're doing is forthtelling. It's telling you right now what you need to fix, what you need to do differently, that kind of thing. And Jesus was very much in that mode. I think the people of his day would have seen Jesus as a prophet, no doubt about it. They would have seen him as a prophet. And these stories, now see, the Old Testament, again, I said the parables are not easy to get. Well, in the Old Testament, the rabbis in the Old Testament and the prophets, sometimes they would use riddle. You look at the story of Samson. He uses a riddle, right, to trap people. Riddles are even harder. I mean, they're even harder than parables, right? So they really wanted you to work at it. So the prophet, it's not easy to get someone to open their eyes and see something in a very different way. And so almost like you have to go and hit someone over the head with a bat, not literally, but metaphorically. You have to hit them over the head with a bat to get them to see it, or at least to start to see it, right? So you see that I gave the example of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus basically exploded his worldview, hit him over the head with a bat. Parable of the prodigal son does the same thing. The parable of what was called the merciful master, where he had these workers coming at half day, and workers worked the whole day, but he paid them all the same, right? Well, that's like, that's mind blowing. How does he do that? Why does he do that? How did that happen? This was questioning everything that they understood about the way life worked. The way life worked is that if I worked all day, I got paid more than the guy who only worked 1 hour, right? That's the way life works. And Jesus is exploding that worldview of the way life worked. So I think, to Amber, to your point, and Craig, you made the point as well, if you come away from reading these parables with warm fuzzies, you probably didn't read it right, okay? You got to go back and read it again and ask God to speak to you and to reveal to you what's happening in the parable, because most of the parables were not meant to give warm fuzzies.
Do I have time for one more thing?
Yep, sure.
When you were just talking, it reminded me of when people read the parables, I would like them to stop and read them and almost reflect on them as if they're standing in a museum looking at a beautiful piece of art. And each parable is its own piece of art. And it's mysterious, and you can kind of make out some of it, but it draws you in, but maybe even makes you feel off, like something's not right about it. I don't know what the art's making you feel. I just want you to feel something. Notice the colors and the textures and the shapes of this picture. And the good news is at this museum, we have the artist standing next to us. And so I have the opportunity to ask, tell me about why you made that stroke. What does that mean? And good news is Jesus actually here in this chapter of Matthew, we actually get some of his explanations, which is not always true. We don't always get that. So we are lucky here. But I just want people to step back, see them in this way they've never seen them before, notice them, how they make them feel, maybe the underlying tones of the kingdom and the upside down nature of Jesus, not just a moral, not digesting them as just a moral thing that we're supposed to leave. Like I'm supposed to change the way I act. It's not, that's what it's all about. And then recognize that Jesus is there in the museum with them, and you have the opportunity to go talk to him and reflect and talk to him about what these parables mean. And I don't think we do that. The disciples asked him, I don't understand this. Tell me more. I want to be that disciple who says, tell me more, Jesus. I want to understand this better.
Very good. Yes, that's great. We're going to end with that as a great word, Amber, for those of you who are reading the parables. Just like a painting draws you in, ask yourself, why is it drawing me in? Why is it doing this to me? And I think you'll go a long ways. Hey guys, thanks for sharing with us. Those of you out there, thanks for following us along with the podcast and the Well Bible Reading Journey. I pray that God blesses you this week and you have a great week reading his word and hearing from God. God bless you until we see you again.
Bye.